Welcome to Conquering College Cost. I'm Frank Palmasani, and this particular video is about the planning phase. Now, when I talk about planning, I'm not talking about starting at when the student is 5 years old and putting resources away for planning. That's certainly an important element of this process. But I'm talking about you as a high school parent, a parent of a high school student, and you're trying to plan for this obvious inevitability of college costs. Now, I'd like you to focus on this particular diagram, this graph, because I think it's a beautiful explanation, an illustration of what we're trying to accomplish here. You're going to notice there are three elements of planning that are integrated. You know, if I was talking to a group of students, not a group of parents, but students, and I talked about the importance of academic planning for college, I may say things like this. You're going to want to look at schools that have the major or program that you're most interested in. You're going to want to make sure that those programs are of the quality that you are most interested in. Students would understand that. They think and appreciate and understand the importance of that idea. If I talk to students about the significance and importance of going to colleges, considering colleges where you're going to be comfortable, where the atmosphere is right for you, where the location is right, students would get that. They would understand that idea. This is where it gets a little muddy. When we move to the next segment, you're going to want to look at schools that don't put you into excessive debt positions, that are not going to be harmful to you financially or your family financially long term. Do they really have an understanding, an appreciation? Do they have the know-how to understand this financial fit concept? I would suggest that they don't. And that's why for the last 40 years or so, I have delivered programs to parents, because I believe that parents have to take absolute and total control of this particular element in this process. What I'm hoping to show you in this planning phase, how you're going to be able to do that efficiently and effectively, and how you're going to help your son or daughter integrate those ideas so that you're working together on this end goal of finding the best college, the best university, from an academic point of view, from a feel point of view, and from a financial point of view. Let's start this discussion by going back to our theory of columns. Do you remember early on in the introduction, I suggested that you're going to create a 4-column chart. I think we talked about a 3-column chart. We're going to move to a 4-column chart. Well, one of the things we want to initially do is focus on column 2 and column 3, getting away from thinking about the sticker price and now looking at this estimate that we call net price and then eventual out-of-pocket cost. And I'm also going to suggest that in the process of applying to universities, as we go through and explain to you how we get there, that you're going to want to help your son or daughter by suggesting to them that they apply to financial reaches, schools that might appear to be beyond what you can afford. But we also are going to encourage you to make sure that they apply to financial fits, schools that do hit that affordability threshold, and maybe even financial backups. Now, let's go in and explain what those mean and the steps. It seems to me that the first step of this process is that you are going to want to get some help in relationship to assessing and determining what it is you can actually afford on an individual basis, on a yearly basis. And perhaps the first thing you ought to do is think about what's reasonable borrowing and what is excessive borrowing. Ultimately, let me give you some data, and that might help you. Think of $60,000, because if we take the average amount of student debt as it relates to undergraduate education, and add in the average amount of parent debt, we get over a 4 or 5 year continuum about a $60,000 debt commitment. That's an average. Is that reasonable to your family? Perhaps not. And so ultimately, assess that. What is reasonable before you even go on to that second element of assessing affordability? How do I look at affordability in a systematic way? I can just take a number out of the blue. I can just go ahead and suggest this is what we believe we can afford to pay on a yearly basis. Or you can do it systematically by looking at cash flow. What am I paying for now that I won't be paying for my son or daughter when they're away at college? By looking at tax credits, am I eligible to have some of my federal taxes reduced because we have college costs? By looking at available savings, and by going back and assessing this idea of reasonable borrowing. Now, you're going to notice on the slide that we're suggesting see handouts. We have handouts in all of our segmented presentations that you can use as a backup, as a permanent resource. So at the bottom of every video, you can always see where these links are, where you can obtain those handouts to help you. And this is one of the handouts. All right, the next particular component I'm going to get into in great depth, and that is looking at the pricing options. It's important to understand, like every other commodity out there, colleges have pricing categories. And if you understand these categories, that will help you assess and determine where you can find those institutions that are more likely to reduce that sticker price. And then finally, recognizing the importance of using these planning tools, these software programs that earlier we called net price calculators that are available on every college website, so that you can create your column 2. All right, I talked about pricing categories. Now it's important to understand what these categories are. And as I said earlier, what is their philosophy as it relates to sticker price reduction? So let's start with state-supported institutions. And we have a category that we call flagship, the premier state-supported institution in a given state. Most people know who these are. These are the most prestigious. These are the largest institutions. I'm doing this presentation from Illinois. We know in Illinois we have one of these, the University of Illinois at Urbana. However, maybe if you lived in Iowa or were looking at schools in Iowa, you would say University of Iowa, we know, is the flagship. You might include Iowa State. But if you were going in Indiana, they would certainly say both IU and Purdue. And in Michigan, they would certainly say both Michigan and Michigan State. Point is, most states are going to have one of these flagships. Some states might have 2, maybe 3 state-supported institutions they consider to be flagships. Now, one of the things we know about flagships as it relates to sticker price reduction on the merit side is that typically this is a category that is not as likely to provide these opportunities at some of the other categories of institutions. Some of these state-supported institutions are more difficult to obtain these resources than others. My experience has been that institutions south and some institutions west that are considered flagships are more inclined to provide merit-based sticker price reduction than others. Others perhaps in the East Coast, certainly some others in the Midwest. Then we look at the other state schools that we call non-flagship state schools. So these are state-supported institutions that aren't the flagship, but every state typically has multiple state-supported institutions. Again, in Illinois, we know who these are: Northern, Eastern, Southern, Western, UIC, Illinois State. These are our non-flagship state support institutions. Now, what we find out in these institutions is typically for students in the state, they will have lower sticker prices. Oftentimes there are merit dollars available. And even the non-flagship state schools out of state, as I indicated in an earlier video, many of them are demonstrating how a student might be able to get in-state fees charged to them even if they live out of state. And in some cases, even provide other merit scholarship options. So this can be a category of schools that might be financially attractive to many families. Now let's move on to the privates. And what I'm going to do is segue away from the highly selectives for a minute and talk about two other categories of private institutions. We call these the mid-sized privates and the traditional privates. Now, the mid-sized privates are a generally small group of institutions with some very recognizable names. Loyola, DePaul, Marquette, St. Louis University, Bradley, the University of Tampa, Creighton, the University of Dayton, and there are a number of others. These institutions will always provide merit-based dollars when a student is accepted. And they are typically eager to work with families on those particular topics. And also, you'll find this in the traditional privates. Usually, families think of the traditional privates as the smaller colleges. Now, one of the things you find that this particular category does better than typically the others, and that is really get into researching and examining the gifts, the strengths, and the talents of your son or daughter. Because if they can stack awards together, provide multiple ways to reduce sticker price, because perhaps the student is involved in art, and there might be that opportunity. Perhaps the student is involved in theater, or as an athlete, or as a leader. Many of these traditional privates, smaller colleges, will look to research those opportunities with your son or daughter to get that sticker price reduced even more. Let me go back now and talk a little bit about the highly selectives. Of course, we know who they are. These are the Ivies. This is University of Chicago, Northwestern, Notre Dame. This particular category of schools are less interested in the merit side. Many of these institutions don't provide merit-based money, or maybe a limited amount of merit-based money. But yet they're very strong on the need-based side of the process. If you recall from that earlier seminar, we differentiated need-based opportunities with merit-based opportunities. But I will say to you that the way they assess and determine that need is quite different. So in addition to this one document that we heard about before called FAFSA, they'll ask for other information. Usually that other information is found in a program called the CSS profile. I'll talk about that later. They'll gather that information and then make an assessment as to whether or not they can provide resources on the need-based level. I will say to you, it's difficult for students to get admitted to these highly selective institutions. But if your son or daughter has the academic muster to consider them, certainly go to those websites, look at those net price calculators, find out if indeed those institutions might be affordable, even though you're going to see those very, very high sticker prices. Now you're going to notice from the particular slide, there are two other backup opportunities. I look at the backups as, well, what if you were to examine institutions, example institutions in each of these categories, and you were looking to match what that net price was. Now remember, we're not looking at sticker price. We're looking at net price from the net price calculators, and you're trying to find these financial fits, but you're not able to. It appears as if every example you look at is beyond your affordability. Now, you might want to examine some backups. Do you know that a major aspect of the cost of an institution has nothing to do with the classroom experience, and it has nothing to do with the degree at the end of the experience? Of course, it's living on a college campus. Living on a college campus today is going to cost a family maybe $10,000, $12,000, $14,000, $15,000 a year. And so, is it prudent for you to think about the four-year institutions in your community where your son or daughter could live at home and potentially save that cost and still get the quality education that you're aiming for? Let me share with you something personally. I have 4 children. 2 of my children lived on a college campus. 2 lived at home. They're all working adults today, and I will tell you something about the 2 that lived at home. They're still fine. Nothing happened to them because they couldn't indeed live on a college campus. Now, I don't want in any way undersell the value of that experience. All I'm suggesting is you have to bring some financial prudence to all of this. And then, of course, there's that other backup option, and that's the going to the community college. Now, there are many, many reasons why families might choose community colleges that are academic in nature, or even on the field side. But strictly from a financial perspective, we know obviously that that can be a wise financial move. Taking advantage of those very low costs over 2 years allows a student to transfer to the institution of choice, and maybe over a 4-year period of time, find that it can be very, very affordable. And so ultimately, the point of this method is to understand that there are pricing categories. And the more you know about these pricing categories, and the more that you can convince your son or daughter to at least examine institutions in each of these categories, apply to schools in these categories in this process, will allow you eventually to make this prudent choice in the end, matching your affordability with those best schools. Now, let's take a look at an example. In a handout, you're going to see an example family. And what we did in this scenario is we create a 4-column chart. And this is something that I'm going to encourage every family to do. You start with sticker price. You take example colleges in each of the categories, and you look up their sticker price. Then you go to their net price calculator, and you indeed look at that estimated cost to you, which we call the net price. Now, we're going to go into the execution phase, which is going to be our next video. And as you assess and determine from this list, here are the schools the student is going to actually apply to. Now we're going to eventually get into column 3, your out-of-pocket cost. And I'm going to also introduce to you another idea, and that idea is column 4. Because in this new methodology, FAFSA simplification, it's going to be even more important for your son or daughter to apply to a number of different institutions and for you to go through what we call the appeal process. Because the only way that institution, those universities are going to learn more about you financially to allow you to get that lower sticker price as possible, that lower out-of-pocket cost as possible, you may very well have to engage in a column 4, which we call the appeal process. Bottom line is we're going to encourage them to apply to financial reaches, apply to financial fits, and apply to financial backups.